Convoy takes the classic roguelike formula and drops it into a Mad Max-inspired post-apocalyptic wasteland.
Yes, if FTL had been directed by George Miller, then this might have been what we ended up with. The game begins with your spaceship crash landing, and to fix it, you'll have to scavenge the necessary parts from the surrounding desert.
And that's where your convoy comes in. There's a main truck and its 2 support jeeps. During the action sequences, you can't manually steer the truck though, so your focus will be on positioning the 2 jeeps to attack enemies and keep the truck safe. And that won't be easy.
Oh man, talk about a steep learning curve. I was just settling in and getting used to the game's combat mechanics when, wham, my jeep gets wiped out in a crash.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting twist to the car chase formula. The overhead view reminds me of those difficult old top-down races like Micro Machines. Although to help you with the limited view, the game does flash up warning icons just before obstacles appear.
Once I had my head around those driving mechanics, it was pretty easy to avoid the crashes. Plus, the game helpfully gives your jeeps a ramming move. Time it just right and you can KO enemies with burnout-style takedowns.
When it comes to combat, your truck just starts off with a pretty weak stun ability, making it pretty useless in fights. This leaves your jeeps to carry the encounters, and this means positioning them close to enemies because of their limited range.
I was a bit underwhelmed by that initial combat. There just wasn't much strategy to it since your jeeps target automatically once they're in range. Thankfully, things do get a bit better once you buy more powerful weapons.
Yeah, I think the game has a much stronger second half, but before we talk about that, we should explain the basics. During your scavenging, you'll be navigating around a small map, then watching the story play out and making choices in text-based screens. You mentioned FTL earlier, which I think is a good comparison because they are very, very, very similar.
Yeah, a little bit too similar if you ask me. I mean, sure, it adds some of its own ideas to the combat, but everything else is pretty much a carbon copy. Just like FTL, your 2 main resources are fuel to explore with and scrap for buying better gear in shops. Even the choices like bribing pirates or escaping from battles feel very familiar.
Yeah, it copies FTL beat for beat, but I think the developers have been pretty open about where they get their inspiration from. And FTL is a pretty niche experience, so I'm just happy to see more of it because it's fantastic.
Well, I will say that at least this game didn't punish me as much for playing as an honourable explorer. Ambushes were rare, and normally my kindness was repaid.
Obviously, I roleplay jerk.
Obviously.
You come across a trading caravan that lacks armed guards. Hail them, blast them, or ignore them. Obviously, blast them. I wipe them out, and I can loot the wreck. I get 2 new weapons, score. In the wasteland, there's no rules, Hex.
As we mentioned earlier, the gameplay jumps up a notch once you get access to better weapons, especially your main truck, which pretty much becomes a pile of guns on wheels. And each of your weapons has its own cooldown timer, so knowing when and where to aim each one is the real strategy.
Definitely. I even got to the point where I started using my jeeps as sheepdogs, herding enemies into kill boxes where I'd rain death on them. Oh, and how good is the laser?
Yeah, overpowered is an understatement. It carves through enemies, and even your own jeeps if you're not careful. So I tended to keep my jeeps on one side just to give my laser free reign on the other. We should wrap this up though. Barjo, final thoughts?
I enjoyed my time in the wasteland, Hex, especially those later battles where you're just madly trying to survive mines and missiles. And I just love these kinds of games, Hex. They're perfect when you've got a laptop and you're in bed just before you go to sleep, you've got a cup of tea.
Oh, your little blanket pulled up to here, I know what you mean.
A scattering of cats. I'm giving this 3.5 out of 5 stars.
Well, I'm not sure that this game did enough to step out of the shadow of FTL. And I had some minor gripes, like the way you can't upgrade your vehicles at all without returning to camp. So it's 2.5 from me. A scattering of cats.
Yeah, it's just pleasant.
Just scattered across the bed.
Yeah, different spots.
I get one under each armpit.
Oh yeah.
Trying to get to the warmth.
Yeah.
And I sleep like this.
I get one under there, one at my butt, and one just kind of walks about attacking everything else.
Okay, right.
Yeah.